September 1940, London. The air raid sirens wailed across the city for the third night in a row, families huddled in basement shelters and underground tube stations, listening to the distinctive drone of German bomber engines overhead. Then came the whistling sound of falling bombs, followed by explosions that shook the ground and shattered windows blocks away. But something about these raids felt different, felt wrong. The German planes were hitting their targets with deadly accuracy, even though the city was completely dark. Street lights were off, windows were covered with blackout curtains. There was no moon that night. Yet somehow the bombs kept landing exactly where they would cause the most damage. In just 9 days between the 7th and 15th, over 1,000 civilians died, factories burned, apartment buildings collapsed into rubble, hospitals overflowed with the wounded. The Royal Air Force sent up night fighters to intercept the bombers, but the British pilots could barely see anything in the darkness. They flew blind, hoping to stumble across an enemy aircraft by chance. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the black sky, but without seeing their targets, the gunners were just guessing. Most shells exploded harmlessly in empty air. The German bombers kept coming, night after night, and they kept hitting what they aimed at. RAF intelligence officers gathered in their operations rooms, studying maps covered with red pins marking bomb impacts. The pattern was clear and terrifying. The German planes were not just lucky, they were not just well-trained. Something was guiding them to their targets with precision that should have been impossible in total darkness. Senior commanders held emergency meetings. Some thought the Germans had spies on the ground, shining secret lights to mark targets. Others believed enemy agents were using radio signals to guide the bombers in, but none of these theories explained how hundreds of German aircraft spread across miles of sky could all find their targets on the same night. British scientists estimated that if this continued, if the Luftwaffe could keep bombing with this level of accuracy, Britain's ability to make weapons and planes and supplies would be destroyed within months. The island would be defenseless, invasion would follow, the war would be lost. Into this crisis walked a young man who seemed completely out of place. Dr. Reginald Victor Jones was just 28 years old. 2 years earlier, he had been teaching physics at a university, working with students and writing papers about infrared light. He was not a soldier. He wore glasses and spoke quietly. He looked like he belonged in a classroom, not in a war room. But someone in the government decided that Britain needed scientists helping with intelligence work, and Jones was assigned to the Air Ministry with the title of Assistant Director of Intelligence Science. Most of the military officers he worked with did not take him seriously at first. Jones spent his days reading reports from spies, studying photographs taken by reconnaissance planes, and interviewing captured German air crews. He was looking for clues, for any hint that might explain the bombing accuracy. In one report, he found a curious detail. A prisoner of war, a German pilot, had mentioned something called Nickebein during questioning. The word meant crooked leg in German. When Jones asked what it meant, the intelligence officer who did the interview shrugged. "Just a radio beacon," he said. "All planes use radio beacons to help them navigate. Nothing special." But Jones kept digging. He found another mention of Nickebein in a decoded German message, then another in a technical manual recovered from a crashed bomber. The pieces did not fit the story of a simple beacon. Jones began to form a theory, one that seemed impossible but explained everything. He believed the Germans were using radio beams transmitted from stations in occupied France, Holland, and Germany. These beams would stretch across the sky like invisible roads. German pilots would fly along one beam until they crossed a second beam, coming from a different direction. Where the two beams intersected, right over the target, the pilot would drop his bombs. Jones presented his theory to his superiors at the RAF. They did not believe him. "Radio beams cannot work that way," they told him. "Radio waves spread out over distance. A beam that starts narrow in France would be miles wide by the time it reaches England. It would be useless for precise bombing. Besides, if the Germans had such technology, British scientists would know about it. We would have invented it first." "You are wrong," they said. "The bombing accuracy must be due to something else." Even when Jones showed them the intelligence reports, even when he pointed out the repeated mentions of Nickebein, the senior officers dismissed him. One commander suggested the Germans were deliberately planting false information to mislead British intelligence. Another said Jones was too young and inexperienced to understand military aviation. The institutional resistance was like a brick wall, but Jones could not let it go. He studied radio physics, teaching himself about directional antennas and signal propagation. He calculated how narrow a beam could theoretically remain over hundreds of miles. He read everything he could find about German radio technology. And slowly, by piecing together fragments from different sources, He built a complete picture of what the Germans had created. The system was brilliant in its design. The German transmitters used special antennas that focused radio waves into beams only 500 yards wide over Britain. A bomber pilot would hear a steady tone in his headphones when he was flying correctly along the beam. If he drifted left, he would hear dots. If he drifted right, he would hear dashes. By keeping the steady tone, he could follow the invisible road in the sky with incredible precision. A second beam, transmitted from another station, would cross the first beam directly over the target. When the pilot heard that cross-beam signal, he would know he was seconds away from the release point. It was like flying on invisible railroad tracks that led straight to British cities. This was Jones's insight, his challenge to the consensus. The Germans had not broken the laws of physics. They had just applied them more cleverly than anyone expected. And if Jones was right, Britain was facing a weapon that its leaders did not even believe existed. Jones knew he needed proof, something undeniable that would force the RAF to take his theory seriously. He contacted Dr. Robert Cockburn, who worked at a research station where scientists developed new radio equipment for the military. Cockburn was skeptical at first, but he agreed to help. If these German radio beams really existed, they reasoned, then a plane with the right equipment could detect them. They just needed to know where to look and what frequency to listen for. From the intelligence reports and technical documents, Jones calculated that the German beams probably operated around 31.5 megahertz. This was a frequency that could travel long distances and be focused into a narrow beam with the right antenna design. He studied maps and figured out where the German transmitter stations must be located based on the bombing patterns. If his calculations were correct, the beams would pass over certain areas of England at specific angles. All they needed was a plane, a receiver, and a brave pilot willing to fly a search pattern in the dark. 3 months earlier, on the night of June 21, 1940, Squadron leader H.E. Bufton climbed into an Avro Anson aircraft that had been specially modified with sensitive radio equipment. His orders were unusual and secret. He was to fly over Worcestershire at exactly 20,000 feet altitude, following a zigzag pattern while listening to his radio headphones tuned to 31.5 megahertz. Most pilots would have thought the mission was crazy, searching for invisible beams that senior officers said did not exist. But Bufton trusted the scientists on the ground, who assured him there was something up there to find. The plane took off at dusk and climbed into the darkening sky. Bufton leveled off at the correct altitude and began his search pattern, flying north for several miles, then turning and flying south, then north again. For over an hour, he heard nothing but static in his headphones. The radio operator sitting behind him adjusted dials and checked connections. Everything was working properly. They just were not finding anything. Then at exactly 10:15 in the evening, Bufton heard it. A steady tone in his headphones, clear and strong. It grew louder as he flew forward, then softer as he passed through something. He banked the plane around and flew back across the same path. There it was again. A narrow corridor in the sky where the signal was strongest, and on either side the signal faded away. When he was centered in the corridor, the tone was solid and unchanging. When he drifted to the left, he heard dots in Morse code. When he drifted to the right, he heard dashes. It was exactly what Jones had predicted. Bufton continued flying along the beam, following it like an invisible road. Then suddenly he heard a different signal, a series of rapid beeps that lasted for about 30 seconds. This was the crossbeam, the signal that told German pilots they were approaching their release point. Bufton marked his position on his map and radioed down to the ground. The crossbeam had appeared directly over an industrial area outside Birmingham, one of the targets the Germans had been hitting repeatedly. Jones's theory was not just correct, it was perfectly, precisely correct. The next morning, Jones rushed to brief his superiors with Bufton's detailed report. The evidence was undeniable now. A British pilot had flown through a German radio beam and documented exactly how it worked. But Jones faced a new problem. Knowing the beams existed was not enough. Britain needed a way to stop them, and the obvious solution, jamming, had a major flaw. If the British simply transmitted noise on the same frequency to block the signal, the Germans would immediately know their system had been discovered. They would change frequencies or develop new systems. The element of surprise would be lost. Jones had a better idea, one that was far more clever and far more dangerous for the Germans. Instead of blocking the beam, what if Britain could bend it? What if they transmitted a fake beam, a ghost beam, slightly offset from the real one? German pilots would receive both signals at once. Their instruments would average the two beams together, and the result would pull them off course. The Germans would think their equipment was working perfectly, but they would be following a path that led away from their targets. They would drop their bombs on empty fields and never know they had been tricked. The technical challenges were enormous. Working from a cramped office with almost no budget and borrowed equipment, Jones and Cockburn's team had to build transmitters that could match the German frequency to within 0.1 kilohertz of precision. The slightest error, and the system would not work. They needed to delay their false signal by exactly zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.5 milliseconds to create the right kind of interference. The transmitter had to be powerful enough to reach aircraft flying at high altitude, which meant building 500-watt units from scratch with parts that were in short supply because of the war. And they needed to do all of this quickly before the next major German raid. Cockburn assembled a small team of engineers and technicians who worked around the clock. They built the first prototype transmitter in a workshop, testing it over and over until the frequency was exact and the timing was perfect. They mounted it on a truck so it could be moved to different locations. The whole system was given the code name Aspirin, though no one wrote down why they chose that particular name. On August 15th, before they had official permission to turn on their jammer, Cockburn made a bold decision. A large German raid was expected that night against Bristol, a major port city. He ordered his team to drive the prototype transmitter to Watchet, a small town on the Somerset coast, and activate it. If the system worked, German bombers following the beam toward Bristol would be pulled off course. If it did not work, Cockburn would probably face serious consequences for operating unauthorized radio equipment during a military operation, but he believed in Jones's calculations and his engineers' work. He gave the order to switch on the transmitter. The next morning, reconnaissance planes flew over the Bristol area to photograph bomb damage. What they found shocked everyone. There were bomb craters scattered across open countryside 15 miles west of Bristol. Farms had been hit, fields had been torn up, but Bristol itself had barely been touched. The German bombers had followed their instruments perfectly, trusting the beams to guide them to their target. And the beams had lied to them. They had dropped hundreds of bombs on nothing. Wing Commander Edward Addison had been watching Jones's work with growing interest. When he saw the results from the Bristol raid, he became a true believer. Addison arranged for a demonstration where Jones's team would bend a test beam while Addison watched from an observation post. The scientists transmitted their false signal and measured the result. The beam shifted by 8 degrees at a distance of 200 miles. Addison did the calculations in his head. An 8-degree error at 200 miles meant a German bomber would miss its target by 28 miles. This was not just a trick, this was a weapon. Addison personally brought Professor Frederick Lindemann, who was Winston Churchill's chief scientific advisor, to see the system in operation. Lindemann was known for being difficult to impress and suspicious of new inventions. But when he saw the beam bending in real time, when he understood the elegance of the deception, he immediately authorized funding and resources. By September, Britain had 6 aspirin stations operating along the coast, each one positioned to bend the German beams away from major cities. The early results were remarkable. German bomb patterns that had been tightly clustered over factories and dockyards suddenly became scattered and random. Luftwaffe crews reported strange instrument readings, but blamed their own equipment rather than suspecting British interference. On September 15th, the day that would later be celebrated as the climax of the Battle of Britain, German bombers attempting to hit London's docks instead dropped their ordnance across open countryside. Analysis after the raid showed that bombing accuracy had dropped by 70% compared to previous attacks. What had begun with institutional rejection and a young scientist working alone was now becoming a systematic defensive operation, and the Germans had no idea they were fighting an invisible enemy. The difference was like night and day, visible in numbers that told a story of life and death. Before British jamming began, German raids guided by Knickerbein beams were devastatingly accurate. On November 14th, when the Luftwaffe attacked the city of Coventry, 65% of their bombs fell within 1 mile of their aiming points. Factories that built aircraft engines and parts were hit hard, buildings collapsed, fires raged through the medieval city center. In the month that followed, Coventry's aircraft production dropped by 30% because so many facilities had been damaged or destroyed. The same pattern repeated in Birmingham, where precision bombing crippled industrial areas that were vital to Britain's war effort. But by December 1940, everything had changed. Britain now operated 22 jamming stations positioned along the coast and inland, covering every major route that German bombers used to approach their targets. Teams of operators worked in shifts around the clock, listening for German beam signals and immediately activating their countermeasures. When a German pilot turned on his radio receiver and tuned to the Knickerbein frequency, expecting to hear the steady tone that would guide him to his target, he heard that tone. His instruments showed he was following the beam correctly. Everything seemed normal, but the signal he was following was actually a blend of the real German beam and a false British beam, pulling him gradually off course with every mile he flew. The results showed up in the bombing statistics. German accuracy dropped dramatically. Less than 20% of bombs now fell within their intended target zones. Luftwaffe crews reported that their instruments seemed unreliable, that the beams seemed to wander and shift. Some pilots started to doubt their training. Others blamed their equipment. But none of them suspected the truth that British scientists were invisibly manipulating the signals they trusted completely. The Germans were not fools, though. Their engineers knew that radio systems could be jammed, and when they noticed the decline in bombing accuracy, they developed more sophisticated systems to defeat whatever Britain was doing. In early 1941, they rolled out X-Gerät, which meant X-device in German. This system was far more complex than simple Nickebein. It used multiple crossed beams operating at different frequencies between 66 and 75 megahertz. More importantly, it included a distance measuring capability. The bomber's equipment would calculate exactly how far the aircraft had traveled along the beam, giving the crew precise information about when to release their bombs. The Germans believed this system would be impossible for the British to jam, because it required understanding not just the beam frequencies but also the distance measuring calculations. Jones and his team learned about X-Gerät from intelligence reports and by monitoring German radio transmissions. Within weeks, they had developed a countermeasure they called bromide. The British transmitters would send false distance signals that fooled the German equipment into thinking the aircraft had traveled farther along the beam than it actually had. German bombardiers would release their bombs too early before reaching their targets. Once again, the bombs fell on empty countryside, while the crews believed they had followed their procedures perfectly. Then came wailed, the most advanced system the Germans developed during the Battle of Britain. This system used a single beam combined with sophisticated range-finding technology. A ground station in occupied Europe would track each individual bomber, measuring its distance and sending corrections directly to that specific aircraft. It was like having a remote controller guiding each plane individually. The Germans were certain this system could not be defeated because it was constantly adjusting and correcting for any interference, but Jones's team created Domino, a countermeasure that was almost beautiful in its cleverness. The British system would capture the radio signal being sent from the German ground station to the aircraft, then retransmit that same signal back with a carefully calculated delay. The German equipment would receive its own signal twice, the real one and the delayed echo, and the range-finding calculations would be thrown off completely. The bomber crew would think they were in one position when they were actually miles away. The night of May 8, 1941, demonstrated just how effective these countermeasures had become. The Luftwaffe launched a major raid against Derby, specifically targeting the Rolls-Royce factory that built engines for British fighter planes. This was a high-priority target, important enough that the Germans assigned 156 bombers to the mission. The raid commander was an experienced officer who had led successful missions before. He briefed his crews carefully and made sure every pilot understood the importance of hitting the factory. That night, the German bombers took off from their bases in occupied Europe and flew toward England. They tuned their radios to the wailed frequency and received clear guidance signals from their ground station. Everything appeared to be working perfectly. The pilots followed their instruments exactly as they had been trained. When the signal told them they were over the target, they released their bombs and turned for home. The raid commander filed a report saying the mission had been executed successfully, but when reconnaissance planes photographed Derby the next morning, they found that only 24 of the 156 bombers had actually hit the city. The rest had scattered their bombs across 40 square miles of Derbyshire countryside, a success rate of just 15%. Typical of what British countermeasures had achieved across all raids. Farms were cratered, a few country houses were damaged, but the Rolls-Royce factory was almost untouched and continued production without interruption. The German High Command was furious. The raid commander was investigated for incompetence and suspected of deliberately sabotaging the mission. His career was destroyed, but he had done nothing wrong. He had followed his instruments perfectly. Those instruments had simply been feeding him lies created by British scientists 200 miles away. By May 1941, the British radio countermeasures network had grown to 80 stations, employing over 1,200 personnel. These were not soldiers, but mostly civilian technicians and engineers, working in secret facilities that did not officially exist. And they monitored German frequencies constantly, ready to activate jamming at a moment's notice. The Germans tried to fight back with their own countermeasures. They changed frequencies rapidly, sometimes several times during a single raid, forcing British operators to track the changes and adjust their equipment in minutes. They transmitted multiple beams simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm the defenders. They even tried training their crews to navigate by traditional methods, using maps and landmarks. But this was nearly impossible in the darkness over blacked-out cities. The invisible battle had become a full-scale electronic war, and Britain was winning. Winston Churchill himself mentioned it in a speech to Parliament in June 1941, though he was careful not to reveal any technical details that might help the enemy. He called it a wizard war of science, where British cleverness had turned German certainty into confusion. Jones was promoted to Director of Scientific Intelligence, a remarkable achievement for someone who had been dismissed and doubted just a year earlier. The Air Ministry calculated that radio countermeasures had reduced British civilian casualties by an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 people over the course of the Blitz. Thousands of families still had their homes because German bombs fell on empty fields instead of city streets. The scale of the achievement was extraordinary. Britain had manufactured over 300 specialized jamming and deception transmitters of various types, integrated into a nationwide network coordinated from RAF Fighter Command headquarters. The Germans had invested enormous resources into developing what they believed were unbeatable radio navigation systems. Britain had beaten all of them without firing a single shot, using nothing but radio waves, mathematics, and the willingness to try something that conventional military wisdom said was impossible. The Luftwaffe effectively abandoned beam-guided bombing of Britain by mid-1941, not because they wanted to, but because their technology had been turned into a liability rather than an advantage. The Battle of the Beams did not end when the war ended. What Jones and his team created in those desperate months became the foundation for an entirely new type of warfare, one that is still being fought today in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1940. The idea that radio signals could be weapons, that invisible waves in the air could be manipulated to deceive and confuse an enemy, transformed how nations thought about technology and conflict. After the war, both Britain and the United States built entire military branches dedicated to what they called electronic warfare. And every technique they used came directly from lessons learned in the night skies over England. Jones himself became one of the most respected intelligence figures of the 20th century. In 1946, King George VI knighted him for his contributions to winning the war, and he became Sir Reginald Jones, though he never liked drawing attention to himself. He could have pursued a career in government or military intelligence, but instead he returned to what he loved most, teaching and research. He accepted a position as Professor of Natural Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where he taught physics to students for the next 35 years. His lectures were famous for being clear and engaging, full of real stories from his wartime work that illustrated complex principles in ways anyone could understand. But Jones was not forgotten by the intelligence community. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the world came close to nuclear war, President Kennedy's advisors called Jones for consultation on Soviet military technology. The United States government awarded him the Medal of Freedom, their highest civilian honor, for his contributions to Western security. Intelligence agencies from multiple countries sought his advice on problems involving technology and deception. He wrote a memoir in 1978 called Most Secret War that became required reading for anyone studying intelligence work. The book revealed many secrets that had been classified for over 30 years, showing in detail how the Battle of the Beams had been won. Jones lived to see his ideas evolve into technologies he could barely have imagined. He died in 1997 at the age of 86, respected and honored as the father of scientific intelligence. Near the end of his life, he gave interviews where he reflected on what he had learned. The most important lesson, he said, was never to assume that any technology is truly unbeatable. Every system has weaknesses. Every design makes assumptions. The key is finding those assumptions and exploiting them before your enemy realizes what you are doing. The specific technologies Jones worked with, the radio beams and the jamming equipment, became obsolete within years, but the principle behind them never died. It evolved and grew more sophisticated with each passing decade. During the Cold War, American and Soviet forces engaged in constant electronic warfare, jamming each other's radar, deceiving each other's navigation systems, intercepting each other's communications. The Vietnam War saw extensive use of radio jamming and deception. When American pilots flew missions over North Vietnam, they carried equipment that could detect enemy radar and confuse missile guidance systems, direct descendants of the tools Jones had pioneered. Then came the satellite age and the Global Positioning System, GPS, which uses radio signals from satellites to tell receivers on the ground exactly where they are located. GPS revolutionized navigation for both military and civilian use. Ships, planes, cars, and even smartphones rely on GPS signals to know their position within a few feet. But anyone who studied Jones's work knew immediately that GPS had the same fundamental vulnerability that nicobine had. If you could transmit a false GPS signal, you could make a receiver think it was in a different location. You could bend the invisible road in the sky, just as Jones had done in 1940. Military forces around the world developed GPS jamming and spoofing technology. These systems are used in every modern conflict. In the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgent groups used simple jamming equipment to interfere with GPS-guided weapons. In Ukraine, both Russian and Ukrainian forces used GPS spoofing to protect their positions and deceive enemy drones. Ships in the Persian Gulf regularly report their GPS systems showing false positions, indicating that someone nearby is transmitting deception signals. The technology has changed completely, but the tactic is identical to what Jones invented 80 years ago. One of the most dramatic examples happened in 2011 when Iran claimed to have captured an American RQ-170 stealth drone by hacking its navigation system. The drone, one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, was flying a reconnaissance mission over Iranian territory when it suddenly landed intact at an Iranian military base. Iranian engineers later said they had used GPS spoofing to fool the drone into thinking the Iranian airbase was actually its home base in Afghanistan. The drone's computers received false GPS signals, calculated a false position, and followed what it believed were correct navigation instructions to land safely right into enemy hands. American officials never confirmed this story, but the technical details matched exactly what Jones had proved was possible, that you could take control of an enemy's navigation system and guide it wherever you wanted. Because of this vulnerability, every military GPS receiver now includes anti-spoofing technology, complex encryption and authentication systems designed to verify that GPS signals are genuine. But this creates an endless cycle. Defense creates new protection. Offense finds new ways around that protection. Defense responds with even more sophisticated systems. The wizard war that Jones described in 1941 never stopped. It just moved to new frequencies and new technologies. Even civilian technology had to adapt to these lessons. Self-driving cars rely on GPS for navigation. If someone could spoof the GPS signals to an autonomous vehicle, they could cause accidents or steal the car by making it drive somewhere else. Aviation systems use GPS for landing aircraft in bad weather. Spoofing those signals could cause crashes. Financial networks use GPS timing signals to synchronize transactions. Disrupting those signals could crash global markets. Engineers designing all of these systems have to think like Jones thought, assuming that any signal can be manipulated and building in protections against deception. The broader lesson Jones taught reaches far beyond radio and navigation. In the modern world of computers and networks and encrypted communications, the same principle applies. Companies and governments build systems they believe are secure, just as the Germans believed nicobine was secure. They assume their encryption is unbreakable, their networks are protected, their data is safe. But somewhere, someone like Jones is studying those systems, looking for the hidden assumptions, finding the weaknesses that the designers never considered. Every system built by humans can be understood by humans, and anything that can be understood can be exploited. The story of the Battle of the Beams reminds us that the greatest danger often comes not from the enemy who destroys your weapons, but from the enemy who turns your weapons against you. The Germans lost the Blitz not because British fighters shot down their bombers or because anti-aircraft guns hit their targets. They lost because they trusted their technology absolutely, and that trust was exploited by people who refused to believe anything was unhackable. The German bombs still exploded with the same force. The bombers still flew at the same speed, but all that power was redirected, wasted on empty fields because someone had bent the invisible roads in the sky. Today, every secure system, every encrypted message, every authenticated network faces the same test. Somewhere, someone is trying to be the next Jones, searching for the hidden weakness, the unexpected vulnerability, the clever trick that will turn strength into weakness. The invisible war continues, fought not with bullets and bombs, but with mathematics and physics and creative thinking. And the side that wins is usually not the side with the most powerful technology, but the side that best understands that no technology is ever truly invulnerable.